Okay, stats. This is what you kind of asked for, so I'm going to try to give this to you piece by piece. So one of the first things we worked on in this new unit was trying to calculate the sample proportion probability question. Okay, so some of the things that we need to know in this problem, or in these problems, is the fact that the assumption that P, which is the population proportion, and P hat, which is the sample proportion, they're going to have the same value, or should have the same value. Whenever you're doing a sample proportion question, the sample proportion probability questions will always be answered using z-scores. So you're going to be using the z-table. All right? It doesn't matter about standard, it's a sample proportion that's going to be a z-score. Okay? Before we can answer any probability question, we have to be able to state conditions, because we need to know whether the distribution is normal and what standard deviation formula we can use. So the first thing is we're going to check to see if it's an SRS. The second is the population must be at least 10 times the sample size. If this is true, we used this as the standard deviation formula for the problem. P times 1 minus P over N, and it's the square root of that. That's going to be our standard deviation we're going to use for the problem. Okay, the standard deviation will not be included in the question. We will calculate it. Next, we need to see if the distribution is normal. So we check this. If n times p is greater than 10, or n times 1 minus p is greater than 10, then we can assume the distribution is normal. All right? So those are our conditions. Once we satisfy those conditions, we can begin to answer our probability questions. All right? So for homework tonight, I gave you this question, and this question goes through the pieces of what we just talked about. So it says we're going to choose an SRS of size n from a large population with a population proportion p having some characteristic of interest. Let p hat be the proportion of the sample having that same characteristic. All right? These are just general questions. What is the mean of the sampling distribution? All right? So the mean of the sampling distribution is considered P or P hat. So the mean of the sampling distribution is going to be P hat, but it's also going to have the same value as P. What is the standard deviation of the sampling distribution? Well, if the population is large, it says a large population, if the population is at least 10 times larger than the sample, then the standard deviation that we're going to use for the sampling distribution is going to be P times 1 minus P over N. That P is the population proportion. If not given, then we can use P hat. Number 3, under what conditions can the formula for standard deviation of P hat be reasonable and accurate? So what are the conditions that the formula can be? And that is our condition number 2, which is the population must be at least 10 times the sample size. Right? So there is our criteria for number 3. Number 4, the sampling distribution P hat is approximately normal when the sample size n is large. According to the adopted rule of thumb, what condition do we require in order to be able to assume the normal approximation for the sampling distribution P? And that's the number 3 that we talked about. N times P needs to be greater than 10, and n times 1 minus P needs to be greater than 10. And if this is true, then it's normal. Okay, so this is our normal test. All right? So then we come down to this, and it talks about, here's our question. And our question says, power companies kill trees. I think we went over this, but we'll talk about it anyway. Power companies kill trees growing near their lines to avoid power failures due to falling limbs and storms. Applying a chemical to slow the growth of the trees is cheaper than trimming, but the chemicals kill some of the trees. Suppose that one such chemical would kill 20% of the sycamore trees. The power company tests the chemical on 250 sycamores. Consider this an SRS of the population of all sycamore trees. All right? So, first question, what are the mean and standard deviation of the proportion of trees that are killed? All right? So the mean and the standard deviation, the mean is going to be your P hat, which is 0.20. And your standard deviation is going to be the square root of 0.20 times 1 minus that, which is 0.80, divided by my n, and my n is going to be 250. So the standard deviation is going to be 0.025298. Okay? Now it says, what is the probability that at least 60 trees, or 24%, again, we're using the percent, are killed? All right, so here's the question we have to answer. So to answer a probability question, we're going to have to go through conditions and everything else. But let's go ahead and state this problem. I want the probability that my p hat value is going to be greater than, at least means greater than, 0.24. Hey. So that's what I'm looking for. So if that's what I want, then that's going to turn into 1 minus the probability that p hat will be less than 0.24, which equals 1 minus the probability that the z-score is going to equal some value. So this is the probability question I'm going to eventually want to answer. To be able to answer this question, I have to go through my conditions. And I have to make sure the conditions are satisfied so I can make some conclusions. The first condition is an SRS, and that's true because it's stated in the problem. The second condition would be the population of all sycamore trees being 10 times my sample, of which is 250. And that's, we're going to have more than 2,500 sycamore trees, so that's good. And then number 3 is going to be the n times p is greater than 10, and n times 1 minus p is greater than 10. So n is going to be 250. The probability, or the p hat value, or p value, is going to be 0.20. That needs to be greater than 10. And then n times, or 250 times 0.8 has to be greater than 10. All right, this is going to be 50 is greater than 10, so that's good. And this is going to be 200 is greater than 10, so that's good. So we know it's normal. So we know based on all that my distribution now is going to be normal. The p-value is going to be 0.20 or 0.2, and the standard deviation, because the number 2 is passed, is going to be 0.025298. Okay? So now knowing this, I can calculate a z-score for this. So my z-score for 0.24 is going to equal 0.24 minus 0.2 divided by the standard deviation, 0.025298. This is going to equal 0.04 divided by 0.025298. And that's going to be 1.58. So there's my z-score. So that's going to go here, 1.58. So the answer to this question is going to be 1 minus, and then I need a z-table. Now I'm not going to be able to find one. So I want my z-table to be 1.58, so 1.58, 9429. So this is going to equal 1 minus 0.9429, and we're going to get 0.0571. So there's the probability that I get a sample, that in my sample of 250 sycamore trees, that more than 24% of the sample will be killed by the spraying. Okay, so that's how you do the question. That takes you through everything you need to know about sample proportion and how to answer a probability question. Next is going to be sample proportion and how to answer a confidence interval question.